Hey everyone, and welcome to your Java tutorial on for loops. So as you can see, I have our previous example pulled up. So I wanted to kind of begin our lesson in for loops where our lesson in while loops left off. So I'm going to get rid of our do while loop here, and let's just focus on our while loop. So as we know, or as we discussed, our while loop, it kept incrementing our counter until our counter reached our target number. So every time we went through one iteration of the while loop, we added 1 onto our counter. So once the counter equaled 100, this counter not equal to 100 was no longer true, so it returned false, and we exited our while loop. A for loop can work in a similar way. So a for loop will keep executing until a condition is met because it's a loop, and that's what loops do. But a for loop has sort of like 3 parts. So talk about them now. So the first part is there's 3 statements, and the first statement is our initial condition, or I guess not, it's our starting point, sort of. Our starting point for the condition. The next piece, and that starting point is followed by a semicolon. The next piece is it defines the logical condition for executing the instructions. So that would be sort of this piece of the while loop. The starting point for the condition is sort of like this statement right here. So it's kind of just setting up our counter. It's our starting point. We increment the counter. That's our starting point for our while loop. That can also be our starting point for our for loop. The next piece, number 2, defines a logical condition for executing the instructions. That's similar to this. Right? This part of our while loop, the actual condition. And our third piece is the instruction that is executed after the code block runs. So our instructions are held inside of a code block here, right? And so we'll have an instruction that will run after that, and that instruction is going to be similar to this counter +1 here. So let's look at the syntax for our for loop. So as you might have guessed, it starts off with the for keyword, and then we have our open and close parens. And this is where our 3 conditions will go. There are 3 statements will go here. And then inside of this code block is where our instructions will go. So let's get to it and let's create our statements. So our first statement is going to be, we're going to create an integer we'll call it I because that's the convention, and we'll set it equal to 0. That's our first condition, and it's the starting point. Remember, it's similar to our counter up here, except for in this case we're going to call it I. Next, we need to define our logical condition for executing the instructions. So as long as this logical condition evaluates to true, the for loop will keep running. Next, we have to define the logical condition for executing the instructions. So what this is going to be is I needs to be less than or equal to 100. As long as this evaluates to true, as long as I is less than or equal to 100, the for loop will keep running. And we can also set this to be I is not equal to 100 as we did above, but I'd like to make it less than or equal to 100. And so the last piece we need to do is an instruction to be executed after the code block runs. What we're going to do is write I++. This is another operator. It's a unary operator similar to this operator right here. What this does is it increments an integer by 1. So after this code block runs, our integer I will be incremented by 1. And so what we'll do is inside here, we will system.out.println, go down to the integer parameter, and we will print I. So that's another cool thing about for loops is that, so we're creating an integer here for this first statement. Inside of our code block, we can refer to that integer of I. So that's kind of cool. As long as I is less than 100 or equal to 100, this code block will execute. After this code block executes, you're going to add 1 to I. Awesome. So I'm going to comment out our while loop over here. I'm going to comment that out. And I'm going to do a system.out.println. I'm going to say, let's begin our for loop. Cool. I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to paste it below. Oops. I'm going to paste it below. And actually, I'll say let's end our for loop after the for loop ends. So as you can see, we ran up to 100 with our while loop. Let's clear that though, and let's run this. As you can see, we ran again, since let's end our for loop. We ran again all the way to 100 from 0. And so what happened here, we hit the let's begin our for loop instruction. We entered in our for loop, and we printed out our print line because we created our I variable, and we set it to 0. It's an integer. And I is indeed less than 100. So we printed this out. Once we finished our code block, right, we incremented it by 1. So then I equaled 1. And so 1 is less than 100, which is our logical condition. So we ran our code block. Perfect. After we ran our code block, we incremented it by 1, which is our instruction to be executed after the code block runs. And it kept doing this, and it kept running until we got to 100. And just for the sake of consistency, let's use our not equal to operator here, just so that you can see it'll run the same as or the exact same as or very similar to a while loop. So we'll run it, and this time it's because it starts at 0. Once it increments to 100, it checks the condition and does not run it. So that's why it stopped at 99 this time. But everything else was the same. It started at 0, increments. Once the print statement happens, after the print statement is done, it incremented to 100. It checked it against 100 and did not run this code block. So there you have it. The while loop would do that exact same thing. We saw in our previous tutorial, it did do that same thing when we had our print line coming before our counter increment. So that is sort of the broad strokes of a for loop. So it's a lot of information. You might want to watch this video a couple times just to sort of understand in a more detailed way how a for loop works. For loops are really good to use in conjunction with arrays. In fact, we might revisit for loops when we talk about arrays and collections later in this course. But for now, that's all you need to know about for loops. Thanks.